There is a photograph, grainy, black and white, taken by a police surveillance camera hidden across the street from a modest storefront on Mulberry Street. In it, a tall man in a dark overcoat stands in a doorway, cigar clenched between his teeth, eyes fixed on something beyond the lens. He isn't smiling. He isn't scowling either. He simply watches, the way a man watches who has already decided how a thing will end before it begins. The detectives who tailed him for decades would later say that his eyes were the worst part. Not cruel, exactly. Just empty. Like looking into a blue so pale it wasn't there at all. One federal prosecutor described him as a man who liked to peer into a victim's face at the final moment, the way a dark angel might, patient, almost tender, right before the lights went out. They called him Neil. Sometimes they called him Father O'Neill, because he had a habit of dressing as a priest when the occasion called for it, a black cassock, a collar, a rosary tucked into his coat pocket, right next to a loaded revolver. He once shot a man dead while wearing that collar, and for the rest of his life, the joke followed him into every social club and every courtroom, the gangster who killed like a devil and dressed like a saint. But here is what almost no one outside of that world understood, and what this story is going to show you: Neil Dellacroce was not the man who wanted the throne. He was the man who held it up. For 30 years, while bosses came and went, while wars broke out and truces were signed in blood, while a young hot-headed kid named John Gotti was still stealing car radios in Brooklyn, it was Dellacroce who kept the machine running. He was the underboss, second in command of the most powerful crime family in America, and yet in many ways, he was the one thing standing between order and chaos. This is the story of a man who was feared by killers, trusted by bosses, and loved, genuinely loved, in that strange underworld way, by the young man who would go on to destroy everything Neil Dellacroce spent his life protecting. This is a story about loyalty in a world that has none. About the price of holding an empire together with nothing but reputation, fear, and the unbreakable code of a dying tradition. About a man who chose, again and again, not to take the crown, and what that choice ultimately cost the family he served. Stay with us. Because by the end of this story, you will understand why, on the day Neil Dellacroce died, the entire structure of the American Mafia began to collapse, and why the men who once feared him would spend the rest of their lives wishing he was still there to hold it all together. Before we step into the shadows of Little Italy, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching this from, and what time it is right now as you press play. I read every single one, and there's something almost eerie about seeing this story reach living rooms and late-night phone screens across the globe, all at once, all listening to the same secrets from the same dead men. Now, turn the lights down low, because where we're going, the streets don't forgive, and neither does the man we're about to meet. New York City in the second decade of the 20th century was not a place that made promises to poor people. It was a city of tenements stacked on top of tenements, of pushcarts and coal smoke, of 10 people crammed into 2 rooms with a single window facing an air shaft that never let in enough light to read by. And it was into this world, on March 15, 1914, that a boy named Aniello John Dellacroce was born to Francesco and Antoinette Dellacroce, 2 immigrants who had crossed an ocean carrying almost nothing but the hope that America might be kinder to their children than Italy had been to them. It wasn't. Little Italy, the neighborhood where the Dellacroce family settled, was a world unto itself, a square mile of Manhattan where the old country had been rebuilt out of brick and desperation. Italian was spoken more than English on Mulberry Street. Church bells from Most Precious Blood rang out over pushcart vendors hawking figs and second-hand shoes. And underneath all of it, quietly, invisibly, ran a second economy, one built on debts, favors, protection money, and violence, administered by men who called themselves nothing more dramatic than friends of ours. Young Aniello, who would soon be known simply as Neil, an Americanized clip of his Italian name, grew up watching that second economy operate in plain sight. He watched grocers pay tribute to men in pressed suits who never seemed to work a day in their lives. He watched police officers nod respectfully to those same men on the street corner, the way a subordinate nods to a superior. He learned, the way every child in that neighborhood eventually learned, that there were two sets of laws in America, the ones printed in newspapers, and the ones enforced by men who didn't need paperwork to make you disappear. His family was poor even by the standards of Little Italy. Work was scarce, and what work existed rarely paid enough to keep a family of 5 fed through a New York winter. Neil had one brother, Carmine, and the two of them grew up fast in a neighborhood that did not have the patience for slow children. By his early teenage years, Neil had already been arrested for petty theft, nothing dramatic, nothing that would have marked him out from 100 other hungry boys on that block. But it was a beginning. A door cracked open just wide enough for him to glimpse what lay on the other side. What set Neil apart, even then, wasn't recklessness. Plenty of boys in Little Italy were reckless, they burned bright and dangerous and were usually dead or in prison before they turned 25. Neil was something rarer. He was patient. He watched before he acted. He listened to the men on the corners, the way they talked, the rules they followed even when no policeman was there to enforce them, the unwritten code of silence, of respect, of never, ever going to the authorities no matter what happened to you. Where other boys saw only opportunity for a quick score, Neil saw an entire architecture of power, built brick by brick out of fear and obligation, and he began, almost instinctively, to study its blueprints. By the late 1920s and into the 1930s, the criminal underworld of New York was undergoing a violent transformation. Prohibition had turned bootlegging into one of the most profitable industries in American history, and the old world Sicilian and Italian gangs, loosely organized, feuding among themselves, still bound by old customs from villages half a world away, were being reshaped into something far more structured, far more ruthless, and far more American. This was the era of the Castellamorese War, a brutal internal conflict between rival factions of the Italian underworld that would ultimately give birth to the modern American Mafia as we know it today, the 5 families of New York, each with its own boss, underboss, capos, and soldiers, all bound together under a ruling council that would come to be known as the Commission. Neil Dellacroce came of age in the middle of this transformation. He joined what was then known as the Mangano crime family, one of the 5 emerging power blocks, and it was there that he crossed paths with the man who would shape the rest of his life, Albert Anastasia. If you know anything about the history of organized crime in America, you know the name Albert Anastasia. He was, quite simply, one of the most feared men who ever walked the streets of New York, a founding architect of Murder, Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the national crime syndicate that carried out contract killings across the country with an efficiency that would have impressed any legitimate corporation. Anastasia earned the nickname, the Lord High Executioner, not through exaggeration, but through documented, cold-blooded fact. He did not hesitate. He did not negotiate. When a problem needed to be removed from the earth, Albert Anastasia removed it, and he did so with a kind of joyless professionalism that terrified even his own allies. It was under Anastasia's wing that Neil Dellacroce truly became who he was going to be. Picture it, a young man, still in his teens, still carrying the accent and mannerisms of Little Italy, standing in the shadow of a man whose name alone could empty a room. Anastasia did not take young protégés lightly. He tested them. He watched how they handled pressure, how they handled violence, how they handled the terrible weight of what this life demanded of a man. And Neil, quiet, watchful, unshakable, passed every test that was put in front of him. He is believed, according to those who studied his rise, to have participated in several killings carried out at Anastasia's direction during these years, the exact number lost to history, deliberately obscured by a code of silence that neither man ever broke, even decades later, even under oath, even facing prison. This was the era before wiretaps, before organized crime task forces, before the RICO Act gave prosecutors real teeth. It was a world that policed itself, judged itself, and executed its own sentences, and Neil Dellacroce learned to operate within that world not as a wild animal thrashing for survival, but as something closer to a surgeon, precise, controlled, and utterly without visible emotion when the moment demanded it. There is a story from these years that would follow Dellacroce for the rest of his life, whispered in social clubs and repeated by federal agents who could never quite verify it but never quite dismissed it either. The story goes that Dellacroce, still establishing his reputation, killed a man while disguised as a Catholic priest, cassock, collar, the full disguise, to get close enough to his target without raising suspicion. The kill was clean. The disguise worked exactly as intended. And from that day forward, some of the older men in the neighborhood began calling him Father O'Neill, half in dark humor, half in genuine unease, because there was something deeply unsettling about a man who could put on the vestments of God to do the devil's work, and never once show a flicker of hesitation. Later in life, Dellacroce would occasionally lean into the legend himself, disguising himself as a traveling priest, Father O'Neill, when commission business required him to move quietly between cities, settling disputes between rival families without drawing the attention of law enforcement or rival gangs. It was audacious. It was almost theatrical. And it worked, precisely because no one expected a mafia underboss to be hiding in plain sight in a Roman collar, blessing strangers on a train platform in Ohio while carrying instructions that could end a man's life. But behind the theater, something more important was happening. Neil Dellacroce was building a reputation not just for capability, but for something rarer and more valuable in that world, reliability. In an underworld built on paranoia, where a boss could never fully trust his own capos, where today's ally was tomorrow's witness, where the difference between loyalty and betrayal often came down to which side offered a better deal, Dellacroce became known as a man whose word actually meant something. If Neil Dellacroce told you he would handle something, it got handled. If he gave you his word that a truce would hold, it held. If he was sent to deliver a message, the message arrived exactly as it was given, with nothing added and nothing subtracted. This kind of reliability is rare in any profession. In the underworld of 1930s and 1940s New York, it was almost priceless. Bosses who could not trust their own lieutenants began to specifically request Dellacroce for sensitive matters. Rivals who despised each other would still agree that Neil Dellacroce, at least, could be trusted to carry a message honestly, even if the message itself was unwelcome. He was building, brick by brick, exactly the kind of reputation that does not come from ambition, but from something closer to old-world honor, a concept that sounds almost absurd applied to killers and racketeers, and yet was utterly central to how that generation of mobsters understood themselves. The world outside Little Italy, meanwhile, had no idea what was gestating in its midst. To the average New Yorker reading the papers in the 1930s, organized crime was a distant, almost cinematic threat, something involving Tommy guns and speakeasies, safely confined to headlines and gangster pictures at the movie theater. They did not know that a quiet, watchful young man from Mulberry Street was being groomed, patiently and deliberately, to become one of the most powerful figures in the history of American organized crime. They did not know that the machinery of the mafia, its codes, its hierarchies, its terrible internal logic, was being refined in real time by men like Anastasia and the young protégés who studied at his side. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, the Mangano family, soon to become the Gambino family, solidified its place as one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. Vincent Mangano, the family's nominal boss, found himself increasingly overshadowed by his own underboss, Albert Anastasia, whose reputation for violence and whose network of loyal soldiers had grown far beyond what Mangano himself controlled. It was an arrangement that could not last. Two powerful men cannot indefinitely share a throne, especially not in a world where the only real currency is fear, and fear, by its nature, flows toward whoever is most willing to use it. In April 1951, Vincent Mangano vanished. He was never seen again, and his body was never found. His brother Philip Mangano was discovered shot to death in a marsh in Brooklyn around the same time. No one was ever charged. No one ever really needed to ask who benefited. Albert Anastasia took control of the family that would soon bear his name, and Neil Dellacroce, who had spent nearly 2 decades proving his loyalty and his capability under Anastasia's tutelage, rose right along with him, cementing his position as one of Anastasia's most trusted lieutenants. For a time, it must have seemed to Dellacroce that his path was set. He was standing beside one of the most powerful and feared men in America, a man whose reach extended into labor unions, the docks, construction, gambling, and half a dozen other rackets that generated staggering sums of illicit cash every single week. Anastasia ruled with an iron hand and an almost pathological willingness to order violence at the slightest provocation, a trait that made him feared, respected, and increasingly, quietly resented by the other bosses who sat with him on the commission. Because here is the truth about power built entirely on fear: it is brittle. It does not bend. It does not adapt. And eventually, it breaks the very hands that hold it. By the mid-1950s, tensions within the National Commission had reached a boiling point. Anastasia's unpredictable violence, including reports that he had ordered the killing of a small-time criminal simply for the crime of appearing on television without permission, had made him a liability in the eyes of other powerful men, including a rising, calculating figure named Carlo Gambino, who had spent years quietly building alliances and biding his time within the very family Anastasia now controlled. Whispers began to circulate. Meetings were held that Anastasia was not invited to. The kind of silence that precedes violence in that world began to settle over the family, and men who had spent decades reading the signs of impending bloodshed could feel it coming the way old sailors feel a storm shift in the air. On October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia sat down in the barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan for a shave. Two gunmen walked in, their faces obscured, and opened fire. Anastasia, by some accounts, even lunged at his own reflection in the mirror, mistaking the gunman's image for the men themselves in his final disoriented seconds. He was struck multiple times and died on the barbershop floor, his face covered in shaving cream and blood, in one of the most infamous mob assassinations in American history. The killing was never officially solved. It didn't need to be. Everyone in that world understood exactly what had happened and exactly why. The commission had spoken. Carlo Gambino, the quiet, unassuming man who had spent years positioning himself just outside the spotlight, stepped forward to take control of what would now be known as the Gambino crime family, a name that would become synonymous with organized crime in America for the rest of the 20th century. And here is where Neil Dellacroce faced the single most important test of his career up to that point, a test that would define everything that came after. He had spent nearly 2 decades as Anastasia's loyal soldier. He had been present for the man's rise, had helped enforce his rule, had been personally shaped by his brutal, exacting standards. By every code of loyalty that governed that world, Dellacroce might have been expected to seek vengeance for his mentor's murder, or at minimum to resist the new regime, to make trouble, to remind Gambino that Anastasia's people were still watching, still armed, still dangerous. He did none of this. Instead, Dellacroce did something that revealed, for the first time on a truly historic scale, the exact quality that would define the rest of his career. He recognized that the code of the Mafia was not actually about personal loyalty to any single man. It was about loyalty to the structure itself, to the commission, to the family, to the fragile, violent order that kept the entire system from collapsing into pure chaos. Anastasia was dead. The commission had ruled. And Neil Dellacroce, instead of seeking revenge or exile, quietly, deliberately, pledged his loyalty to Carlo Gambino, the very man widely believed to have orchestrated his mentor's assassination. It was an almost unbelievable act of self-discipline. Imagine watching the man who trained you, who trusted you, who made you who you are, gunned down in a barber's chair, and then walking calmly across the room to shake the hand of the man who ordered it, because the code demanded nothing less, and because you understood, on some deep and unsentimental level, that survival and advancement in this world required you to serve the structure, not the individual. Carlo Gambino noticed. Of course he noticed. A new boss, especially one who has just seized power through violence, is acutely aware of who among his predecessors' men might pose a threat and who might become a genuine asset. Dellacroce's response, calm, controlled, entirely without visible resentment, told Gambino everything he needed to know about the kind of man he was dealing with. Here was a soldier who understood the difference between personal grievance and organizational duty. Here was a man whose loyalty, once given, could actually be trusted to transfer cleanly, without the poison of secret vendettas simmering underneath the surface. It would take Gambino several more years to fully consolidate his power and settle the family's internal structure. But when he did, one of his first and most consequential decisions was to elevate Neil Dellacroce out of the ranks of ordinary capos and place him at the very center of the family's leadership, a decision that would, in time, make Dellacroce one of the most powerful and most trusted men in the entire history of American organized crime. But that promotion, and everything that came with it, is a story for the next chapter of this journey into the shadows. We have watched a boy from a poor immigrant family on Mulberry Street transform, step by step, decade by decade, into a man capable of standing at the right hand of two of the most feared bosses in Mafia history. We have watched him survive the death of his mentor not through violence, but through a discipline and a code that few men, inside that world or outside it, could ever truly master. And we are only at the beginning. Because the true test of Neil Dellacroce's character, the choices that would earn him the nickname, the Underboss who held the streets together, the decisions that would eventually put him face to face with a hot-headed young Brooklyn kid named John Gotti, all of that is still ahead of us. For 8 years after Albert Anastasia bled out on a barbershop floor, Neil Dellacroce did something that very few men in his position have ever managed to do successfully. He waited. Not passively. Not idly. He waited the way a chess player waits, watching the board, tracking every piece, understanding exactly where the pressure points were building, all while giving the appearance of a man who was simply, quietly, doing his job. Carlo Gambino, the new boss, was not a man who trusted easily, and he had good reason not to. He had risen to power through a bloodless coup that had, in fact, been anything but bloodless for the man he replaced. He understood, better than almost anyone alive, that the very qualities that had made him useful to remove Anastasia, patience, discretion, the ability to make alliances quietly while appearing harmless, were qualities that other ambitious men in his own family might one day turn against him. This is the paranoia that sits at the center of every organized crime hierarchy, and it is worth pausing on, because it explains so much of what Neil Dellacroce would go on to become. In a legitimate corporation, a chief executive who inherits the throne can, at least in theory, rely on courts, contracts, and boards of directors to check the ambitions of underlings. In the Gambino family, there was no court of appeals. There was no HR department. There was only the commission, the code, and the cold mathematics of loyalty, who could be trusted, who could not, and how quickly the answer to that question might change if circumstances shifted. Carlo Gambino needed men around him who understood this mathematics instinctively. He needed men whose loyalty was not simply transactional, bought with money or favors, and therefore capable of being bought away by someone offering more, but structural. Men who believed, on some level that went beyond self-interest, in the code itself. Neil Dellacroce had already demonstrated, in the days and weeks following Anastasia's murder, that he was exactly this kind of man. He had absorbed a devastating personal loss, the death of his mentor and benefactor, and rather than seeking vengeance or exile, he had folded himself into the new order without a flicker of visible resentment. But demonstrating loyalty once, in a moment of crisis, is not the same as proving it can be sustained over years. Gambino watched Dellacroce carefully through the early 1960s. He tested him with responsibilities, sensitive assignments, delicate negotiations between warring factions within the extended family structure, tasks that required both. There is something worth understanding here about the psychology of power in organized crime, something that separates men like Dellacroce from the popular Hollywood image of the mafia gangster clawing his way violently to the top. In the world Dellacroce operated in, overt ambition was often a death sentence. A capo who was too visibly hungry for advancement made every other man around him nervous, because ambition of that kind inevitably raised the question, what happens when this man decides that removing his superiors is faster than waiting for them to retire? The men who actually rose to the top of organizations like the Gambino family were, more often than not, men who mastered the art of appearing content exactly where they were, reliable, competent, dangerous. Neil Dellacroce mastered this art completely. And in 1965, Carlo Gambino made his decision. He moved aside his existing underboss, a man named Joseph Biondo, who by most accounts had grown too old and too cautious to effectively manage the family's day-to-day operations, and he elevated Neil Dellacroce to the position of underboss of the Gambino crime family, the second most powerful position in what had, by that point, become the largest and most profitable organized crime family in the United States. To understand what this promotion actually meant, you have to understand the scale of what the Gambino family had become by the mid-1960s. This was not a neighborhood protection racket. This was an empire generating, by some later estimates, close to $1 million a day in illegal revenue, flowing in from construction rackets, garment industry extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling operations that spanned the 5 boroughs, control over key labor unions that touched nearly every major industry in the city, and a growing, increasingly lucrative involvement in narcotics trafficking that many of the old guard bosses publicly condemned while privately, quietly, allowing to flourish under their protection. Dellacroce was now the second in command of all of it. He set up his headquarters, fittingly, just steps from where he had grown up, a modest storefront social club on Mulberry Street called the Rave Night. To anyone walking past it on the street, it looked like nothing at all. A few folding chairs, a coffee machine, old men playing cards in the window, the smell of espresso and cigar smoke drifting out onto the sidewalk. It was, in fact, one of the most important rooms in the history of American organized crime, the beating heart of the Gambino family's operations for the better part of 3 decades, and eventually one of the most heavily surveilled buildings in the entire country, as the FBI and NYPD organized crime units came to understand exactly what was happening behind that unassuming storefront window. As underboss, Dellacroce's responsibilities split roughly into 2 enormous categories, and mastering both simultaneously is what made him genuinely exceptional, rather than simply competent. The first was internal discipline, managing the sprawling network of capos, soldiers, and associates who made up the Gambino family's operational structure, settling disputes between crews before they escalated into violence, approving or vetoing major decisions, and serving as the ultimate check on the ambitions of men beneath him who might otherwise have torn the organization apart through infighting. The second, equally important, was external diplomacy, representing the Gambino family's interests on the Commission, the ruling council of the 5 families, where disputes between entire criminal organizations were negotiated, alliances were formed, and wars were either started or, more often, quietly prevented. Dellacroce excelled at both, but it was this second role, as diplomat, as fixer, as the man other families trusted to deliver an honest message even when the message was unwelcome, that built his legend far beyond the borders of the Gambino organization itself. Bosses and underbosses from rival families, men who would happily have ordered each other killed over a territorial dispute, nonetheless respected Neil Dellacroce specifically because his word, once given, held. If Dellacroce told a rival capo that a truce would be honored, it was honored. If he was sent to mediate a dispute, this reputation reached its most vivid, almost cinematic expression through the continuation of a habit Dellacroce had cultivated back in his younger years under Anastasia, his occasional disguise as a traveling priest, Father O'Neill, when commission business required him to move quietly between cities without drawing law enforcement attention. Picture the scene, because it is almost too strange to be believed and yet is documented in the accounts of the men who knew him, a tall, broad-shouldered underboss of the most powerful crime family in America, riding a train out of Penn Station in a black cassock and a Roman collar, nodding politely to fellow passengers, occasionally offering a blessing to an elderly woman who had no idea she was sitting 3 feet from a man capable of ordering her entire town's criminal underworld. Reorganized by the time he reached his destination. It was audacious theater, but it was also deeply practical, a testament to how seriously Dellacroce took the operational security of the organization he served, and how willing he was to personally shoulder even the most bizarre burdens if it meant protecting the family. Not everything about Dellacroce's rise was quiet diplomacy, however. The underworld he operated in still ran, ultimately, on the threat and occasional application of violence, and Dellacroce's reputation as a man not to be crossed was reinforced by stories that spread through the neighborhood with the particular relish that only true crime folklore can generate. Detectives who worked organized crime cases during this era would later describe him, almost without exception, in terms that bordered on the supernatural. One veteran NYPD detective, reflecting decades later on a career spent surveilling some of the most dangerous men in American history, singled out Dellacroce as uniquely unsettling, describing his pale blue eyes as seeming almost absent, as though there was nothing behind them at all, comparing the sensation of being looked at by Dellacroce to looking through a man rather than at him. There is a particular story, retold for decades in law enforcement circles and eventually confirmed by multiple sources close to the family, that captures the strange combination of menace and control that defined Dellacroce's public persona during these years. According to the account, 2 police officers had been secretly recording Dellacroce, hoping to catch evidence of criminal conversation on tape. Dellacroce discovered them. Rather than resorting to lethal violence against 2 on-duty police officers, an act that would have brought down an entirely unacceptable level of law enforcement retaliation on the family, Dellacroce instead forced the officers, at gunpoint, to physically eat the recording tape they had used to surveil him. It is, on its surface, almost a darkly comic image. But it reveals something important about how Dellacroce operated. He understood, with a precision that many of his more hot-blooded contemporaries lacked, exactly how much violence a given situation could bear before it became strategically counterproductive. He terrified without recklessly escalating. He punished without inviting catastrophe. This calibration, this constant, careful measuring of exactly how far to go and no further, is, in many ways, the entire secret of how he survived for as long as he did in a profession that rarely allowed its practitioners to reach old age. Law enforcement, of course, was not simply going to leave a man of Dellacroce's stature alone, regardless of how carefully he calibrated his violence. As the 1960s wore on, and organized crime increasingly became a matter of national political concern following the shocking revelations of the 1957 Appalachian meeting, where over 100 mafia figures from across the country had been discovered gathering at a rural New York estate, blowing open the public myth that the American Mafia did not exist as a coordinated national organization, federal and state authorities began dedicating unprecedented resources to surveilling, infiltrating, and prosecuting men exactly like Neil Dellacroce. In November of 1966, Dellacroce found himself swept up in an incident that would come to be known, with a certain dry irony among the detectives who broke it up, as Little Appalachian. A meeting had been convened in a private home in Queens, bringing together major figures from across the 5 families, including Dellacroce, representing the Gambino family, alongside men like Joseph Colombo and Carlo Gambino himself, to discuss the redistribution of rackets controlled by Thomas Lucchese, the aging boss of another of New York's crime families, who was gravely ill and not expected to survive much longer. This was exactly the kind of high-stakes internal diplomacy that made Dellacroce's role so essential, a peaceful, negotiated transition of enormously valuable criminal territory, the kind of orderly succession that prevented the sort of violent power struggles that could spill blood across an entire city and draw exactly the sort of attention no one in that room wanted. This composure under arrest was not accidental. It reflected a deeper code that governed how men of Dellacroce's stature were expected to conduct themselves when caught by the authorities: never panic, never talk, never give investigators anything they could use, and above all, never break the silence that protected the organization as a whole, regardless of the personal cost. Dellacroce embodied this code with a consistency that became legendary even among his peers. Over the following years, as federal and state prosecutors intensified their pursuit of organized crime figures, Dellacroce found himself increasingly targeted, not because investigators had a specific case that could put him away for a lengthy sentence, but because his central importance to the Gambino family's operations made him an obvious and attractive target for any prosecutor looking to disrupt the organization's leadership. In 1971, Dellacroce was convicted of contempt of court, stemming from his refusal to cooperate with a grand jury investigation into organized crime activities, a conviction that resulted in a relatively short sentence but that underscored, publicly and undeniably, exactly how committed Dellacroce was to the code of silence that governed his entire world. He would not talk. He would not cooperate. Not for a shortened sentence, not for immunity, not for any deal prosecutors could offer him. This refusal, it would be easy to imagine that a 5-year prison sentence might have ended Dellacroce's career, or at minimum severely diminished his standing within the organization. In many criminal enterprises, extended absence creates exactly the kind of power vacuum that ambitious subordinates rush to fill, and returning to find your former position occupied by someone else is one of the oldest and most dangerous stories in organized crime history. But Dellacroce's standing within the Gambino family was built on something more durable than mere physical presence. It was built on decades of demonstrated reliability, on relationships painstakingly cultivated with capos and soldiers throughout the organization, and on the absolute certainty, shared by everyone from Carlo Gambino down to the newest street soldier, that Dellacroce's loyalty to the family structure was beyond question. He went to prison, and the machinery he had built continued running largely as he had left it, guided by lieutenants who understood exactly what he expected of them and who had no interest in testing what would happen if they disappointed him upon his return. It was during this period, the years surrounding his imprisonment, and the years immediately following his release, that one of the most consequential relationships of Dellacroce's entire life began to take shape, though neither man could have fully understood, at the time, exactly how significant it would become. There was a young man from Brooklyn, from the tough, working-class Italian-American neighborhoods that had produced so many of the family's soldiers over the decades. He had grown up poor, one of many children in a struggling household, and like Dellacroce himself decades earlier, he had turned to petty crime almost as soon as he was old enough to understand that the streets offered opportunities the legitimate world did not. He was brash, aggressive, charismatic in a way that drew other young men to follow him, and hungry for respect in a manner that was almost the opposite of Dellacroce's own carefully cultivated patience. His name was John Gotti. Gotti had come up under the wing of Carmine Fatico, a Gambino capo who ran a crew out of a social club in Brooklyn's Ozone Park neighborhood, and it was through this connection that Gotti and his crew, including men who would remain by his side for the rest of his violent career, first came to Dellacroce's attention. What Dellacroce saw in the young Gotti was, in some ways, a mirror of qualities he recognized from his own younger years: raw physical courage, an absolute willingness to use violence when the situation demanded it, and a natural gift for commanding the loyalty of the men around him. But Dellacroce also saw, from the very beginning, something more volatile in Gotti than he had ever allowed himself to be: an appetite for the spotlight, a taste for personal glory, a hot-bloodedness that ran directly counter to everything Dellacroce's own survival in this business had taught him about the value of patience and discretion. And yet Dellacroce took to him. This is one of the great, aching ironies at the center of this entire story, and we will return to it again and again as this narrative unfolds. The disciplined, patient underboss, the man who had spent his entire career mastering the art of restraint, found himself drawn to and genuinely fond of the one man in the entire organization whose defining trait was an almost total absence of restraint. Perhaps Dellacroce saw in Gotti's raw hunger the fire he himself had banked and controlled for so many decades. Perhaps he simply recognized, with the eye of a man who had spent a lifetime evaluating talent, that Gotti possessed a rare combination of fearlessness and charisma that could be enormously valuable to the family, if properly guided and contained. Whatever the reason, Dellacroce began, gradually, to take a personal interest in the young Brooklyn soldier's development, protecting him from the consequences of his own recklessness on more than one occasion, and setting in motion a mentorship that would ultimately reshape the entire future of the Gambino crime family, and the entire American Mafia along with it. But that mentorship, and everything it would eventually lead to, still lay ahead. For now, in the years following his release from prison in the late 1970s, Neil Dellacroce returned to Mulberry Street, to the Rave Night Social Club, to his position as underboss of the most powerful crime family in America, older, more weathered, but no less respected. Carlo Gambino himself was aging, his health failing, and the question of who would eventually succeed him as boss had begun to loom over the entire organization like a gathering storm. Many observers, both inside and outside the family, assumed the answer was obvious. Dellacroce had spent over a decade as underboss. He had proven his loyalty across nearly 5 decades in the organization. He had weathered prison sentences without breaking, mediated countless disputes without favoritism, and commanded a level of respect throughout the 5 families that few men in the history of American organized crime ever achieved. Surely, when Carlo Gambino finally died, the throne would pass naturally to the man who had spent his entire life proving he deserved it. It would not. And the decision that Carlo Gambino was quietly preparing to make instead, a decision that would blindside Dellacroce, humiliate him in the eyes of men who had watched him serve faithfully for decades, and set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately end in one of the most infamous assassinations in Mafia history, is where our story turns next. Every empire, criminal or otherwise, eventually confronts the same unforgiving arithmetic: the man at the top grows old, and someone else must take his place. For most of the 1970s, as Carlo Gambino's health steadily declined, the entire structure of the Gambino crime family existed in a kind of held breath, waiting to see how that arithmetic would resolve itself. And for most of that decade, nearly everyone who understood how the family actually functioned assumed they already knew the answer. Neil Dellacroce had been underboss since 1965. He had served Gambino with a loyalty that had never once wavered, even under the pressure of prison sentences, federal surveillance, and the countless small humiliations that came with being one of the most closely watched men in America. He commanded the respect of the street, the capos and soldiers who ran the day-to-day rackets, who understood violence and discretion the way Dellacroce understood them, who had watched him mediate disputes for over a decade with a fairness that even the losing side rarely disputed. Within the world of organized crime, seniority, loyalty, and earned respect were supposed to matter. By every metric that world claimed to value, the throne belonged to Dellacroce. But Carlo Gambino was not a sentimental man. He had not survived and thrived at the top of the most powerful crime family in America by rewarding loyalty for its own sake. He was, above all else, a strategist, a man who had spent his entire career thinking several moves ahead of everyone around him, calculating not who deserved power, but who could best be trusted to wield it in a way that protected his own family's long-term interests, including, crucially, his own bloodline. And here is where the story takes its first genuinely painful turn, because the man Carlo Gambino ultimately chose to succeed him was not Neil Dellacroce at all. It was Paul Castellano, Gambino's own brother-in-law, a man who had married into the Gambino family decades earlier and who represented something almost entirely different from what Dellacroce embodied. Where Dellacroce had come up through the old-world traditions of street violence, protection rackets, and the brutal apprenticeship under men like Albert Anastasia, Paul Castellano represented a newer, more corporate vision of what organized crime could become. Castellano was interested in construction, in real estate, in the kind of white-collar racketeering that generated enormous sums of money while keeping its practitioners as far away as possible from the messy, dangerous business of street-level violence. He wore expensive suits. He lived in a sprawling mansion on Staten Island, modeled, according to persistent rumor, on the White House itself, complete with a grand staircase and columned entrance that seemed almost deliberately designed to signal just how far Castellano intended to distance himself from the tenement streets that had produced men like Dellacroce. Carlo Gambino's reasoning, as best as it can be reconstructed from the accounts of those who observed the transition, was rooted in exactly this contrast. He believed the future of organized crime, at least the profitable and survivable future, lay in exactly the direction Castellano was already moving, toward legitimate-seeming business enterprises, toward the kind of quiet, sophisticated racketeering that was harder for law enforcement to penetrate and prosecute, and away from the old-world street violence that had made men like Dellacroce legendary but that also made them enormous, constant targets for federal investigators. There was also, of course, the simple and undeniable matter of family. Castellano was blood, or at least blood by marriage, tied directly into the Gambino name in a way that mattered enormously in a culture built on family loyalty and inheritance. Gambino wanted to keep power within his own bloodline, the same impulse that has shaped the succession of empires, kingdoms, and dynasties throughout human history, criminal or otherwise. When Carlo Gambino died of a heart attack in October 1976, at his home on Long Island, the succession that followed was not the open, contested power struggle that might have erupted in a less carefully managed transition. It had been arranged in advance, quietly, deliberately, in the months before Gambino's death, precisely to avoid the kind of chaotic, bloody leadership battle that had torn apart other crime families in the past. Paul Castellano was named boss of the Gambino crime family. And Neil Dellacroce, the man who had served as underboss for over a decade, who had bled for the family, who had gone to prison rather than betray its secrets, was, by every reasonable expectation, passed over. It is difficult to overstate what a devastating blow this must have represented, both practically and personally. Imagine spending the better part of 30 years proving your loyalty to an organization, watching bosses rise and fall, watching your own mentor gunned down in a barbershop chair, absorbing the psychological and physical toll of a life built entirely around violence and discretion, and then watching the ultimate prize, the position you had spent your entire adult life positioning yourself to inherit, handed instead to a man who had never fired a shot in anger, who had built his entire career. In the comparatively safe world of construction rackets and real estate schemes, and whose primary qualification, when examined honestly, was simply that he happened to be married to the previous boss's sister. And yet, and this is perhaps the single most revealing moment in Neil Dellacroce's entire career, more revealing even than his composed acceptance of Anastasia's murder 2 decades earlier, Dellacroce did not rebel. He did not challenge Castellano's ascension. He did not use his considerable influence among the street capos to foment resistance or force a violent confrontation over what many considered a deeply unfair, almost insulting decision. Instead, in a decision that speaks volumes about both his character and his understanding of the code he had spent his entire life serving, Dellacroce accepted the arrangement that Carlo Gambino had put in place. Castellano would be boss, and Dellacroce would remain as underboss, continuing in the role he had already held for over a decade, serving now under a man he almost certainly considered, on some fundamental level, less capable and less deserving than himself. Why did he accept it? This is a question that has fascinated organized crime historians, journalists, and law enforcement officials for decades, and the honest answer is probably a combination of factors, each of them entirely consistent with the man Dellacroce had shown himself to be throughout his career. Part of it was, unquestionably, the code itself, the deep, almost religious commitment to the structure of the organization that had defined every major decision of his life. Carlo Gambino, as boss, had the authority to name his own successor, and challenging that decision, however personally galling, would have meant challenging the very legitimacy of the system that had given Dellacroce his own power and standing in the first place. A man who believed as deeply in that system as Dellacroce did could not simply discard its rules the moment they failed to benefit him personally, not without undermining the entire foundation of authority and obedience that he himself depended upon to command respect from the men beneath him. There was also, almost certainly, a colder and more pragmatic calculation at work. Open rebellion against Castellano would have meant war, not a metaphorical war, but an actual, bloody conflict within the Gambino family, the kind of internal struggle that historically devastated crime families, invited unprecedented law enforcement scrutiny, and rarely ended well for anyone involved, winners included. Dellacroce had spent his entire career avoiding exactly this kind of destructive, uncontrolled violence. He understood, in a way that few men in his position could have articulated so clearly, that a fractured family was a vulnerable family, and that whatever personal satisfaction might come from seizing power through force would likely be short-lived, purchased at a cost that would ultimately destroy the very organization he had spent his life building and protecting. So Dellacroce did what he had always done. He absorbed the blow, folded it into himself, and continued serving. But the arrangement that emerged in the years following Gambino's death was far from a simple, harmonious partnership. What developed instead was something closer to a divided kingdom, 2 men sharing power over the same organization, but drawing that power from fundamentally different sources, and increasingly, from fundamentally different constituencies within the family itself. Castellano, as boss, controlled the family's more sophisticated, white-collar operations, the construction rackets, the real estate schemes, the kind of high-level corruption that generated enormous wealth while requiring relatively little direct violence. He surrounded himself with capos and associates who shared his sensibilities, men who preferred negotiation to intimidation, who wore tailored suits and worried about their tax exposure, who increasingly saw the traditional, street-level rackets, the loan sharking, the gambling, and especially the narcotics trafficking that had become an enormous and increasingly unavoidable source of revenue throughout the underworld, as beneath the dignity of a modern, sophisticated criminal enterprise. Dellacroce, meanwhile, retained control over what came to be understood, both within the family and eventually by law enforcement, as the street faction, the capos and crews who ran the traditional rackets in Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan, men who had come up the same way Dellacroce himself had come up, through violence, loyalty, and the old-world codes of the traditional mafia. This faction operated largely out of social clubs in the outer boroughs, far from Castellano's mansion on Staten Island, and it included some of the most notoriously aggressive and profitable crews in the entire Gambino organization. Chief among them was a crew based in Ozone Park, Queens, led by a capo named Carmine Fatico, and increasingly, in practical terms if not yet in official title, by Fatico's most promising and most dangerous soldier, John Gotti. We left Gotti in the previous chapter of this story as a young, ambitious soldier who had begun to attract Dellacroce's personal attention and protection. By the early 1970s, that relationship had already been tested in the most extreme way imaginable, in an episode that would come to define much of how Dellacroce and Gotti understood their bond to one another for the rest of their lives. In May 1972, Emmanuel "Manny" Gambino, a nephew of the aging boss Carlo Gambino, was kidnapped for ransom in Brooklyn. Despite the family paying the demanded ransom, Manny Gambino was never returned alive. His body would not be recovered for years. The kidnapping and murder of a member of the boss's own family was, within the logic of that world, an almost unforgivable act of disrespect, a direct assault not just on an individual, but on the entire structure of fear and deference that kept the Gambino family's authority intact. It could not go unanswered. The man believed responsible, James McBratney, was tracked down to a bar in Staten Island in May 1973. According to accounts that would later be corroborated in court, 3 men entered the bar posing as police officers attempting to make an arrest. When McBratney resisted, he was shot to death in the ensuing struggle. One of the 3 men involved in that killing was John Gotti. Gotti was eventually identified, arrested, and charged in connection with McBratney's murder, a serious charge that, if it had resulted in a full conviction on the original terms, could have ended his career, and quite possibly his life, before it had truly begun. It was at this critical juncture that Neil Dellacroce's personal investment in the young soldier revealed itself in the most concrete and consequential way possible. Dellacroce, drawing on his considerable influence and his relationships throughout the legal and criminal underworld alike, worked to secure Gotti representation from Roy Cohn, one of the most notorious and effective defense attorneys in New York, a man whose name would become synonymous, in later decades, with an entirely different and far more famous client. Through Cohn's intervention and negotiation, Gotti was ultimately able to plead guilty to a reduced charge of attempted manslaughter, rather than facing trial on the original murder charge, and received a sentence considerably lighter than the crime might otherwise have warranted. This episode is worth dwelling on, because it illustrates something essential about the relationship that was forming between Dellacroce and Gotti, a relationship that was, from its very foundation, built on exactly the kind of personal loyalty and protection that Dellacroce had spent his entire career demonstrating toward the family's larger structure. Dellacroce was not simply an administrator processing Gotti as one soldier among hundreds. He was actively, personally invested in Gotti's survival and advancement, willing to expend real political and financial capital to protect a young man he had come to see, in some fundamental way, as an extension of his own legacy, the fire and aggression that Dellacroce himself had learned, decades earlier, to control and channel, now reborn in a new generation. Gotti served roughly 2 years at Green Haven Correctional Facility before his release in 1977, and upon his return to the streets, his standing within the Gambino family's Ozone Park crew had only grown. The McBratney killing, rather than damaging his reputation, had cemented it, proof, in the eyes of the men who mattered, that Gotti possessed exactly the kind of fearless willingness to act on behalf of the family's honor that the traditional street faction prized above almost everything else. Dellacroce's continued patronage ensured that this reputation translated into real advancement. When Carmine Fatico, the crew's official capo, found himself sidelined by his own legal troubles and unable to continue running the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club crew that served as the Ozone Park operations headquarters, it was Gotti, with Dellacroce's blessing and support, who effectively assumed control of the crew's day-to-day operations, setting him on a trajectory toward formal recognition as a capo in his own right. By the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, then, the Gambino family had settled into an uneasy, structurally divided equilibrium. Paul Castellano sat atop the organization as boss, presiding over increasingly sophisticated white-collar operations from behind the walls of his Staten Island mansion, a man who by many accounts grew steadily more removed from the day-to-day street-level realities of the family he nominally controlled. Neil Dellacroce, as underboss, continued to command the loyalty and respect of the traditional street faction, running his operations out of the Rave Night Social Club on Mulberry Street, mentoring an increasingly powerful and increasingly ambitious John Gotti, and maintaining, through sheer force of accumulated reputation, a level of influence within the family that in many ways rivaled, and in the eyes of many capos actually exceeded, Castellano's own formal authority. This division was not merely structural or geographic. It represented, at its core, a genuine and growing philosophical rift about what the Gambino family should even be, a rift between an older, traditional vision of organized crime rooted in street-level rackets, personal loyalty, and the willingness to use violence when the code demanded it, and a newer, more corporate vision focused on insulated white-collar enterprises, distance from street-level dangers, and a kind of respectability that men like Dellacroce, on some level, likely regarded as a betrayal of everything the organization had traditionally stood for. For a time, this uneasy division held. Both men, whatever their private frustrations with the arrangement Carlo Gambino had imposed upon them, understood the value of maintaining at least the appearance of unified leadership, and both continued to generate enormous profits for the family through their respective spheres of influence. But beneath the surface, tensions were accumulating that would eventually prove impossible to contain, tensions rooted not just in the philosophical divide between Castellano and Dellacroce's respective factions, but in a growing and increasingly dangerous problem involving narcotics trafficking, a problem that would eventually implicate several of Dellacroce's own closest associates, including men within John Gotti's own crew, and that would place Dellacroce himself in an almost impossible position, caught between his official duty to enforce Castellano's strict prohibition against family involvement in drug dealing, and his deep personal loyalty to the men he had spent years protecting and promoting. It was a problem that would fester quietly for years, hidden behind closed doors and coded conversations, even as federal investigators, increasingly sophisticated in their surveillance techniques, began closing in on the Gambino family's leadership with a level of technological capability that men like Dellacroce, shaped by an earlier era of organized crime, were only beginning to fully appreciate. Wiretaps were being planted. Bugs were being installed in social clubs that had once felt entirely safe. And the empire that Neil Dellacroce had spent 5 decades helping to build was about to enter its most dangerous and its most consequential era, one that would ultimately determine not just his own fate, but the fate of the entire American Mafia as the world had known it for generations. That story, the narcotics crisis that would test Dellacroce's loyalty like nothing before it, the tightening federal net that would eventually catch even the most careful men in its threads, and the deepening resentment between the mansion on Staten Island and the social club on Mulberry Street, is where we turn next. Every crime family in the history of American organized crime has operated under a set of unwritten rules, rules more sacred, in their own way, than anything written into the statutes of the country whose laws they otherwise ignored without a second thought. Chief among these rules, for most of the 20th century, was a prohibition against narcotics trafficking. It was not born of any genuine moral conviction. Men who ran loan sharking operations that ruined families, who extorted small business owners out of their life savings, who ordered killings with the same emotional detachment as signing a business memo, were not, as a rule, troubled by matters of conscience. The prohibition against drugs existed for a far more pragmatic reason. Narcotics convictions carried extraordinarily long federal sentences, and worse, the drug trade had a well-documented tendency to produce informants. Addicts talked. Low-level dealers, facing decades in prison, talked. And the entire architecture of Omerta, the code of silence that had protected organized crime for generations, was far more fragile against the desperate calculations of a man facing life in a federal penitentiary than it had ever been against the threat of violence alone. Carlo Gambino had enforced this prohibition strictly during his tenure as boss, and Paul Castellano, upon assuming leadership of the family in 1976, had continued the policy with even greater rigidity, formally declaring that any Gambino family member caught trafficking in narcotics would face death as the penalty. On paper, this was an absolute, unambiguous rule, backed by the ultimate sanction the organization could impose. In practice, it was already being violated, quietly and profitably, by some of the very men closest to Neil Dellacroce. Chief among them was Angelo Ruggiero, a soldier in John Gotti's Bergen crew, a man whose loyalty to Gotti and whose personal friendship with Dellacroce's own son, Armand, ran deep enough that he occupied a position of genuine trust within Dellacroce's own household. Ruggiero, along with several associates including John Gotti's own brother, had been quietly running a substantial heroin trafficking operation throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, generating enormous profits that flowed, in part, back through the traditional channels of tribute and loyalty that connected every soldier to the capos and underbosses above him. This was, in the starkest possible terms, an existential threat to the entire operation. If Castellano ever discovered the full scope of what Ruggiero and his associates were doing, the official policy demanded nothing less than death for those involved, and by extension, given Dellacroce's close personal and professional relationship with both Ruggiero and Gotti, it threatened to implicate Dellacroce himself in a scandal that could unravel decades of carefully built trust and authority. The situation might have remained a quiet, contained secret indefinitely, managed through the same discretion that had governed so much of the Gambino family's internal affairs for decades, had it not been for a development that neither Ruggiero, nor Gotti, nor even the ever-vigilant Dellacroce could have fully anticipated. The FBI had installed a wiretap in Angelo Ruggiero's home telephone. What that wiretap captured, over months of surveillance beginning in the early 1980s, would come to be known within law enforcement and organized crime circles as the Ruggiero tapes, thousands of hours of recorded conversation in which Ruggiero, apparently oblivious to the fact that federal agents were listening to every word, discussed in extraordinary and damning detail the operational specifics of his heroin trafficking business. He named names. He discussed shipments, prices, and distribution networks with a carelessness that, in retrospect, seems almost impossible to believe from a man who had spent his entire adult life inside an organization built on discretion and paranoia. But this was precisely the seductive danger of the telephone, a private space, inside one's own home, that created a false sense of security entirely disconnected from the technological reality of what federal surveillance had become capable of by the early 1980s. When federal prosecutors eventually indicted Ruggiero in 1983 on narcotics charges, they did something that sent shockwaves through the entire Gambino organization. As part of the standard discovery process in a federal criminal case, transcripts of the wiretapped conversations were turned over to Ruggiero's defense team, and inevitably, given the interconnected and often leaky nature of criminal defense circles, word of exactly what those transcripts contained began to filter back toward the very man the entire scheme had been designed to keep in the dark, Paul Castellano. This is the moment where the slow-building tension between the Gambino family's two great factions, the sophisticated, business-oriented world Castellano had built around himself, and the traditional street faction that Dellacroce commanded, finally began to curdle into something approaching genuine crisis. Castellano, upon learning that members of his own organization had been trafficking narcotics in flagrant violation of his explicit orders, and worse, that they had been careless enough to allow themselves to be captured on federal wiretaps discussing it in granular detail, was, by every account from those close to the situation, incandescent with fury. He demanded that Ruggiero turn over the transcripts of his own recorded conversations, both to assess the extent of the damage and, many believed, to gather the evidence he would eventually need to justify ordering Ruggiero's execution in accordance with the family's own stated policy. Ruggiero refused. This refusal, on its surface a small act of defiance from a mid-level soldier against the family's supreme boss, was in fact an act of enormous consequence, one that could only have been sustained because Ruggiero understood he had protection that went far beyond his own standing in the organization. He was shielded, directly and deliberately, by both John Gotti and Neil Dellacroce. For Dellacroce, this placed him in an almost impossible position, one that tested the very code he had spent his entire life upholding in ways that none of his previous trials, not Anastasia's murder, not being passed over for the top position, not his own prison sentences, had ever quite managed to do. On one hand, Castellano was the official boss of the family, and the code that Dellacroce had spent 5 decades honoring demanded deference to the boss's authority, precisely the same code that had led him to accept Castellano's ascension without rebellion nearly a decade earlier. On the other hand, Ruggiero and Gotti were men Dellacroce had personally protected, mentored, and invested in for years, men whose loyalty to him personally ran deeper, in many ways, than their formal obligations to Castellano, a boss they increasingly regarded as remote, arrogant, and dangerously disconnected from the street-level realities that had built the family's fortune in the first place. Dellacroce's solution, characteristically, was not open rebellion but a kind of careful, protective stalling, using his own considerable standing within the organization to shield Ruggiero from the full consequences of Castellano's fury, buying time, deflecting, and quietly signaling to the capos beneath him that the street faction would not simply hand over one of its own to satisfy Castellano's demands, even as he avoided any direct, irreversible confrontation with the boss himself. It was an extraordinarily delicate balancing act, and it succeeded, for a time, precisely because Castellano, whatever his fury, was reluctant to force a direct confrontation with Dellacroce that might fracture the entire organization along exactly the fault lines that had been quietly widening for nearly a decade. But the underlying crisis did not resolve itself. It festered, month after month, year after year, as federal investigators continued building their case, not just against Ruggiero and his narcotics network, but against the Gambino family's leadership structure as a whole, using the emerging legal weapon of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, which allowed prosecutors, for the first time in American legal history, to charge an entire criminal organization and its leadership as a unified conspiracy, rather than pursuing individual crimes one at a time against individual defendants. This was a fundamentally new kind of legal threat, one that the older generation of mob bosses, shaped by an earlier era of piecemeal prosecutions, had not fully reckoned with, and it would soon prove devastating to organized crime families across the country, the Gambino family very much included. While the Ruggiero crisis simmered, another confrontation was building on a completely separate front, one that would further illuminate the growing rift between Castellano's world and Dellacroce, and would deepen John Gotti's own private resentment toward the boss he increasingly viewed as unfit to lead. In May 1980, John Gotti's young son, Frank, was struck and killed by a car driven by a neighbor, John Favara, in a tragic accident near the Gotti family home in Howard Beach, Queens. The boy had darted out into the street on a minibike, and by every account of those who investigated the incident, Favara bore no criminal responsibility for what had happened. It was, in the plainest and most painful sense, a genuine accident. But grief, particularly grief compounded by the violent worldview that shaped John Gotti's entire understanding of justice and retribution, does not always operate according to legal findings. Favara began receiving threats. His car windows were smashed, and the word "murderer" was spray-painted across its hood. Eventually, in July 1980, Favara vanished entirely, never to be seen again, in circumstances that left little doubt among those familiar with the Gotti family's world about what had actually happened to him, even though no charges were ever filed and no body was ever recovered. This episode, tragic and dark as it was, is worth including in Dellacroce's story not because Dellacroce was directly involved in whatever happened to Favara, but because of what followed it, a moment that illustrates, with painful clarity, exactly how the fault lines within the Gambino family were shifting during this period. Paul Castellano, upon learning of the Favara disappearance, was reportedly deeply unsettled by the entire episode, viewing it as exactly the kind of uncontrolled, emotionally driven violence that threatened to draw unwanted law enforcement attention onto the family at a moment when careful discretion was more important than ever. It was, in Castellano's eyes, precisely the sort of reckless behavior that confirmed his growing unease about the increasingly powerful and increasingly unpredictable capo who had risen through Dellacroce's patronage in Ozone Park. Dellacroce, by contrast, understood the raw, primal grief that had driven Gotti's response, even if he could not officially condone the disappearance of a man against whom no formal case had ever been made. This is not to say Dellacroce approved of reckless, uncontrolled violence. His entire career had been a testament to exactly the opposite instinct, the careful calibration of exactly how much violence a situation could bear. But his relationship with Gotti had, by this point, transcended simple professional mentorship. He understood Gotti not just as a capable soldier to be managed and directed, but as something closer to a surrogate son, a man whose fire and fury reminded Dellacroce, perhaps, of the young man he himself had once been under Albert Anastasia's tutelage, decades before careful restraint had tempered that fire into something more calculated and more sustainable. As 1983 turned into 1984 and then into 1985, the pressures building around the Gambino family's leadership continued to intensify from multiple directions simultaneously. Federal prosecutors, led by a young and increasingly aggressive United States attorney named Rudolph Giuliani, had begun assembling what would become one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions in American history, a sweeping RICO indictment targeting the heads of all 5 families simultaneously, an unprecedented legal assault that would come to be known as the Commission Case, designed to prove, once and for all, in a court of law, that the American Mafia functioned as a coordinated national criminal conspiracy governed by a ruling council, exactly the kind of structural, organizational prosecution that RICO had been specifically designed to enable. Neil Dellacroce, as underboss of the Gambino family and a long-time, well-documented representative on the commission itself, was among the primary targets of this investigation. So too, separately, was Paul Castellano, whose own home had been the subject of an extensive and highly effective FBI bugging operation, one that had captured hours of incriminating conversation about the family's various rackets, conversations Castellano had apparently believed, with a confidence that would prove catastrophically misplaced, were entirely private within the walls of his own mansion. By late 1984 and into early 1985, both men, Dellacroce and Castellano, found themselves facing separate but overlapping federal indictments that threatened to send each of them to prison for the remainder of their natural lives. For Castellano, the evidence gathered from the bugs in his own home was particularly devastating, capturing him discussing family business with a level of specificity that left prosecutors confident they had more than enough to secure a conviction. For Dellacroce, the Commission Case indictment represented the culmination of decades of law enforcement attention, the final, most serious legal threat in a career that had already weathered contempt charges and a tax evasion conviction. But even as these external legal pressures mounted, threatening the very survival of the organization both men had spent their lives serving, an even more consequential and more private crisis was quietly developing within Neil Dellacroce's own body, one that neither federal prosecutors nor rival capos could have anticipated, but that would ultimately prove far more decisive in determining the fate of the Gambino family than any indictment, wiretap, or RICO prosecution ever could. Dellacroce, now in his early 70s, had been diagnosed with cancer. The details of his diagnosis were kept as private as possible, consistent with the same instinct for discretion that had governed nearly every aspect of his life within the organization. But word inevitably spread through the tight, interconnected world of the Gambino family's leadership, reaching Gotti, reaching Ruggiero, reaching the capos of the street faction who had spent years depending on Dellacroce as their protector, their advocate, and their essential counterweight to Castellano's increasingly remote and increasingly resented leadership. And it reached, too, the ears of Paul Castellano himself, who understood, with the same cold strategic clarity that had shaped every major decision of his career, exactly what Dellacroce's declining health might mean for the delicate balance of power that had held the Gambino family together, however uneasily, for nearly a decade. If Dellacroce died, the single most powerful check on Castellano's authority, the one man whose standing among the street capos was substantial enough to restrain them, whose personal loyalty from men like Gotti had kept the growing resentment toward Castellano's leadership from boiling over into open rebellion, would be gone. And what might rise in that vacuum, unrestrained by Dellacroce's careful, decades-honed sense of discretion and balance, was a question that would soon prove to have a far darker and far more violent answer than anyone, even the most paranoid observers of the Gambino family's internal politics, could have fully anticipated. That question, what happens to an empire when the one man capable of holding its warring factions together finally begins to fade, is where the next and most fateful chapter of Neil Dellacroce's story truly begins. There is a particular kind of cruelty in the way history sometimes arranges its timing, and few episodes in the story of American organized crime illustrate this more starkly than the final year of Neil Dellacroce's life. Here was a man who had spent 5 decades mastering the delicate, exhausting art of holding a violent, paranoid, endlessly ambitious organization together, a man whose entire value to the Gambino family had always rested on his capacity to be present, to mediate, to absorb tension before it exploded into open conflict. And now, just as that organization approached what would prove to be the most dangerous and consequential crossroads in its entire history, the one man capable of steering it through safely was dying, slowly and irreversibly, of cancer. Throughout 1985, as his health continued to deteriorate, Dellacroce made a decision entirely consistent with the character he had displayed across his entire career: he kept working. He did not retreat from his responsibilities as underboss, did not withdraw from the delicate diplomatic and administrative functions that had defined his role within the family for 2 decades. He continued receiving visitors at the Rave Night Social Club, continued mediating disputes among the street capos who depended on his judgment, continued serving, even as his body grew weaker, as the essential counterweight to Paul Castellano's increasingly isolated and increasingly resented leadership. But everyone around him could see what was happening, and the psychological effect of a dying underboss rippled through the entire organization in ways that would prove impossible to contain. For the capos and soldiers of the traditional street faction, men like John Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, and their associates in the Bergen crew and beyond, Dellacroce's illness represented something close to an existential threat to their entire position within the family. For years, it had been Dellacroce's personal protection, his willingness to shield Ruggiero from Castellano's fury over the narcotics scandal, his broader standing as the street faction's advocate and protector, that had allowed men like Gotti to operate with a degree of autonomy and security that Castellano, left entirely unchecked, would almost certainly never have permitted. Gotti, in particular, understood with growing clarity exactly what Dellacroce's death would mean for his own future, and for the future of everyone connected to him. Castellano had never trusted Gotti, had never approved of his flamboyant, headline-grabbing style, his expensive suits and his taste for personal publicity that ran directly counter to the code of discretion that had governed organized crime for generations. More immediately and more dangerously, Castellano was fully aware, by 1985, of the extent of the Ruggiero narcotics operation and of Gotti's own brother's involvement in it, knowledge that, once Dellacroce was no longer there to run interference, would almost certainly translate into decisive, potentially lethal action against Gotti's entire circle. Multiple accounts from law enforcement officials and organized crime historians who studied this period closely have concluded that Castellano, freed from the restraint Dellacroce's continued presence had imposed upon him, was seriously considering exactly this kind of purge, a violent housecleaning that would have eliminated Gotti, Ruggiero, and their closest associates in order to finally, permanently resolve the narcotics scandal that had embarrassed and endangered him for years. This was the volatile, high-stakes environment in which a series of quiet, increasingly serious conversations began taking place among Gotti and his closest allies throughout the summer and fall of 1985, conversations about what would happen when Dellacroce finally died, and about whether Castellano's own leadership of the family, a leadership many of them had come to regard as fundamentally illegitimate, remote, and dangerous to their own survival, could be allowed to continue unchallenged. Once the last restraining hand was gone. It is important, in telling this part of the story honestly, to be clear about exactly how much of this plotting Neil Dellacroce himself was aware of, because the historical record here is genuinely murky, filtered through decades of conflicting accounts from FBI informants, cooperating witnesses, and organized crime historians working from incomplete and sometimes contradictory information. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: Dellacroce, even as his health failed him, remained the single most important source of legitimacy and protection that Gotti's faction possessed. Whether or not he was explicitly told the details of any plan being discussed to move against Castellano, his mere continued existence, his willingness to shield his protégés from the boss's growing fury, functioned as an implicit form of protection that made open rebellion, for the time being, unnecessary. Many who have studied this period closely believe that Dellacroce, whatever his private frustrations with Castellano's leadership over the preceding decade, would never have explicitly sanctioned a violent move against the family's official, commission-recognized boss, not because he had any particular affection or loyalty toward Castellano personally, but because such an act would have represented exactly the kind of unauthorized, destabilizing violence that his entire career had been dedicated to preventing. This distinction, between Dellacroce's personal frustrations with Castellano and his absolute, bone-deep commitment to the code that governed how power could legitimately change hands within the commission structure, is essential to understanding what happened next, and to understanding the tragic, almost unbearable irony that would come to define the final act of Neil Dellacroce's extraordinary life. Throughout the autumn of 1985, Dellacroce's condition continued to worsen. He was in and out of hospitals, receiving treatment that could manage his symptoms but could not, by this stage of his illness, offer any realistic hope of recovery. And yet even from what would prove to be his deathbed, he continued to function, in whatever limited capacity his failing body allowed, as the essential mediator between two factions of the Gambino family that both, in their own ways, desperately needed him to survive. Castellano's faction, which needed Dellacroce, continued restraint over the increasingly rebellious street capos, and Gotti's faction, which needed Dellacroce, continued protection against Castellano's mounting fury over the narcotics scandal that threatened to end their careers, and potentially their lives. There is something almost unbearably poignant, when you sit with it, about a man whose entire life's work had been holding together an organization built on violence and betrayal, doing exactly that work with his very last reserves of strength, even as the cancer spreading through his body made clear to everyone around him, including almost certainly to Dellacroce himself, that his time in that role was rapidly running out. He had spent 5 decades absorbing the tensions of other men's ambitions and grievances so that the machine could keep running. Now, in his final months, he was doing it one last time, even as his own body was failing him in ways no amount of will or discipline could overcome. On December 2, 1985, Neil Dellacroce died at the age of 71. The news moved through the Gambino family's network with the particular, electric speed that such news always carries in a world where every relationship is simultaneously professional, personal, and potentially lethal. For the capos and soldiers who had depended on him for decades, his death represented the loss of a genuine protector, a man whose fairness and judgment had, for all his violent history, made the organization function more smoothly and more sustainably than it otherwise would have. For Paul Castellano, Dellacroce's death represented, at least in theory, the removal of the single greatest restraint on his own authority, the final consolidation of undisputed control over a family he had nominally led for nearly a decade but had never fully, completely commanded. And for John Gotti, the death of the man who had protected him since he was a young, hot-headed soldier in Ozone Park, who had shielded him after the McBratney killing, who had continued to shield him and his closest allies through the Ruggiero narcotics crisis, represented something far more immediate and far more dangerous than simple grief. It represented the removal of his last line of defense against a boss who, freed from Dellacroce's restraining influence, might now move against him and his entire circle without hesitation. What happened in the immediate aftermath of Dellacroce's death revealed, with brutal clarity, exactly how thin the peace within the Gambino family had actually become, and exactly how much of that peace had depended on one dying man's continued presence rather than on any genuine, durable reconciliation between the family's two great factions. Paul Castellano did not attend Neil Dellacroce's funeral. This decision, on its surface a small matter of personal scheduling or perhaps simple insensitivity, was received throughout the Gambino family and the broader world of organized crime as an almost unforgivable breach of respect and tradition, a public, undeniable signal that Castellano did not regard Dellacroce, despite his decades of service as underboss, as worthy of even the most basic courtesy that organized crime culture demanded be paid to a fallen leader. In a world governed by codes of honor and respect as rigidly as any medieval court, this single absence carried enormous symbolic weight, confirming for many within the street faction exactly what they had long suspected, that Castellano held them, and everything Dellacroce had represented, in fundamental contempt. The specific reasons behind Castellano's absence remain a matter of some historical debate. Some accounts suggest that Castellano, deeply engaged in preparations for his own upcoming trial in the commission case, along with a separate, equally serious prosecution related to a stolen car ring known as the Eastern Boys High School case, simply calculated that the legal and security risks of attending a funeral certain to be swarming with FBI surveillance agents outweighed whatever symbolic value his presence might have provided. Other accounts, less charitable, suggest that Castellano's absence reflected genuine, long-standing disdain for Dellacroce and everything the Underboss's faction represented, a final, almost gleeful assertion of dominance now that the one man capable of checking his authority was finally gone. Whatever the true reasoning behind it, the practical effect of Castellano's absence was catastrophic for whatever remained of the fragile balance that had held the Gambino family together for nearly a decade. Within Gotti's circle, the snub was interpreted not merely as an insult, but as confirmation of everything they had feared, that with Dellacroce gone, Castellano intended to move against them, to finally settle the narcotics scandal and the broader tensions between the two factions on his own terms, with no restraining hand left to intervene. In the days and weeks that followed Dellacroce's funeral, the conversations that had been quietly building throughout the preceding months, conversations about Castellano's leadership, about the growing danger he represented to Gotti and his allies, about whether the family's official boss could continue to be tolerated, accelerated with a speed and a finality that would have been unimaginable while Dellacroce still drew breath. What had been, during Dellacroce's lifetime, a simmering tension held carefully in check by his continued presence and his continued protection, now transformed, within a matter of days, into something approaching open, active planning for what would become one of the most infamous and consequential acts of violence in the entire history of American organized crime. It is worth pausing here to fully appreciate the tragic architecture of what was unfolding. Neil Dellacroce had spent his entire adult life, nearly 5 decades inside one of the most violent and unpredictable organizations in American criminal history, mastering the art of preventing exactly this kind of catastrophic, uncontrolled internal violence. He had absorbed the murder of his own mentor without seeking vengeance. He had accepted being passed over for the position he had earned through decades of loyal service without triggering a civil war. He had shielded his protégés from a furious boss's wrath while never once crossing the line into open, unauthorized rebellion against that boss's legitimate authority. Every major decision of his career, viewed collectively, forms a portrait of a man whose entire genius lay in preventing the organization from tearing itself apart from within. And now, in the 12 days that would follow his death, everything he had spent his life preventing was about to happen anyway, not despite his absence, but precisely because of it. That devastating 12-day period, and the assassination that would follow, forever altering the course of the American Mafia and cementing, in the most tragic way imaginable, exactly how essential Neil Dellacroce had actually been to holding his world together, is where our story turns next. History rarely announces its hinge points in advance. The men who lived through the 12 days between Neil Dellacroce's funeral and what would happen next did not experience them as a countdown, a dramatic ticking clock building toward an inevitable, cinematic climax. They experienced them, most likely, the way people experience any period of intense, private anxiety, as a blur of hushed conversations, of careful glances exchanged across social club tables, of decisions made and unmade and remade again, each one carrying stakes that could mean life or death not just for the men making them, but for everyone connected to them. But viewed from the distance of history, those 12 days in December 1985 stand as one of the most consequential stretches of time in the entire story of American organized crime, and understanding them requires us to hold two things in our minds simultaneously: the practical, operational planning that was accelerating behind the scenes, and the deeper, almost tragic truth that everything unfolding during this period was possible only because the one man who might have prevented it was no longer alive to do so. With Neil Dellacroce gone, John Gotti and his closest allies, a small, tightly bound circle that included Angelo Ruggiero, Gotti's own brother Gene, and a capo named Sammy Gravano, who ran a construction industry racketeering operation and would go on to play an absolutely central role in everything that followed, moved with a speed and a decisiveness that reflected both the genuine urgency of their situation and the particular psychological freedom that Dellacroce's death had unexpectedly granted them. For years, Dellacroce's continued presence, however sympathetic to their cause, had also functioned as a kind of ceiling on what they could contemplate doing, a living embodiment of the code that made unauthorized violence against a sitting boss almost unthinkable. With that ceiling removed, and with genuine, credible fear that Castellano intended to move against them over the narcotics scandal now that his restraining counterweight was gone, the calculus shifted from theoretical grievance to what Gotti and his allies increasingly framed, at least to themselves and to the men they needed to recruit into the plot, as a matter of survival. The planning that unfolded during this period was conducted with a level of secrecy and compartmentalization that reflected everything these men had learned, across their collective decades in the organization, about the catastrophic consequences of loose talk. Gravano, in later testimony that would become central to the historical record of these events, described a process of careful recruitment among capos and soldiers throughout the Gambino family, sounding out potential support for moving against Castellano, gauging loyalty, identifying which crews could be counted on and which remained too closely tied to Castellano's own faction to be trusted with knowledge of what was being planned. What emerges from these accounts is a portrait of a conspiracy built not on reckless, hot-headed impulse, but on the same kind of careful, methodical planning that had characterized the family's more significant undertakings for generations, a grim irony, given that the entire plot represented exactly the kind of unauthorized, structure-shattering violence that men like Dellacroce had spent their careers preventing. Gotti and his allies understood that moving against a sitting boss without commission authorization was an extraordinarily dangerous gamble, one that could, if it failed or if it was discovered before it could be executed, result in their own deaths at the hands of a commission determined to preserve the fundamental rule that bosses could not simply be murdered by ambitious subordinates whenever convenient. But they judged, correctly as it would turn out, that Castellano's own standing among the other family's leadership had grown weak enough, his reputation tarnished enough by his remoteness from street-level operations and by the mounting legal pressure closing in on him, that a successful move against him might be tolerated, even quietly welcomed, by other bosses who had their own grievances with his leadership style. The immediate, precipitating trigger for finally moving forward with the plot came from an unexpected direction. Word reached Gotti's circle that Castellano was, in fact, actively planning to demote or eliminate several capos associated with the Dellacroce faction, restructuring the family's leadership in ways that would have stripped Gotti and his closest allies of their positions and, quite possibly, their lives, in order to finally resolve the narcotics embarrassment and consolidate his authority in a way that Dellacroce's presence had never allowed him to do. Whether this intelligence was entirely accurate, or whether it was itself shaped by the paranoid, high-stakes atmosphere that had gripped the entire organization in the wake of Dellacroce's death, is difficult to determine with certainty even now, decades later. But for men whose entire understanding of survival in this world was built on acting decisively against threats before those threats could fully materialize, the intelligence was more than sufficient justification to move forward. On the evening of December 16, 1985, just 14 days after Neil Dellacroce's death, Paul Castellano arrived at Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan, accompanied by his driver and de facto underboss, Thomas Bellotti, a Castellano loyalist who had been positioned, in the wake of Dellacroce's death, as a potential future underboss himself, a choice that, had it been allowed to stand, would have further cemented Castellano's complete, unchecked authority over an organization that Neil Dellacroce had spent decades helping to balance. What happened next has become one of the most infamous and most thoroughly documented assassinations in the entire history of organized crime, immortalized in news photographs, congressional testimony, and decades of subsequent film and television dramatization. As Castellano's car pulled up outside the restaurant, four gunmen, dressed in identical light-colored trench coats and fur hats to ensure they would be difficult to distinguish from one another in the chaos and confusion of the moment, stepped forward and opened fire. Castellano and Bellotti were both killed instantly on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, in full view of stunned onlookers, in one of the most brazen public assassinations in modern American criminal history. John Gotti, along with Sammy Gravano, watched the entire assassination unfold from a car parked nearby, a detail that would later prove central to the criminal case built against them, and that speaks to exactly how personally invested Gotti was in ensuring the operation succeeded, and in witnessing, with his own eyes, the death of the man who had passed over and ultimately threatened the faction that Neil Dellacroce had spent his entire final decade protecting. The assassination sent shockwaves through the entire American criminal underworld, and indeed through the broader public consciousness, given the brazen, public nature of the killing and the intense media attention that had already begun to focus on organized crime in New York in the wake of the ongoing commission case prosecutions. Within days, it became widely understood, both within law enforcement circles and within the underworld itself, exactly who had ordered the hit and why, even though it would take years of subsequent investigation, informant testimony, and eventually Gravano's own extraordinary decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors, to fully establish the legal record of what had happened and who was responsible. In the immediate aftermath of Castellano's assassination, John Gotti moved swiftly and decisively to consolidate his own position atop the Gambino family, a maneuver that, whatever its violations of traditional protocol regarding commission authorization for such a dramatic change in leadership, was accepted with relatively little organized resistance from the family's other capos, a testament to just how thoroughly Castellano had alienated much of the traditional street faction during his decade as boss, and to how effectively Gotti's own charisma, ruthlessness, and carefully cultivated reputation had positioned him to fill the vacuum that Dellacroce's death and Castellano's assassination had, in rapid and violent succession, created. It is here, at this pivotal moment in the story, that we must return to Neil Dellacroce and ask the question that historians, journalists, and organized crime scholars have debated for decades since: what would he have made of all this? What would the man who had spent 5 decades preventing exactly this kind of unauthorized, catastrophic violence have thought, had he lived to see the young man he had personally protected and mentored orchestrate the public assassination of the very boss whose authority Dellacroce himself had spent a decade quietly, painfully accepting, even when he believed, with every justification, that the position rightfully belonged to him? There is no way to answer this question with certainty, and any honest telling of this story must resist the temptation to speak with false confidence about what a dead man might have thought or done. But the available evidence, drawn from the accounts of those who knew Dellacroce best and who studied his character across 5 decades of documented behavior, points toward a genuinely painful and complicated answer. Dellacroce, whatever his private frustrations with Castellano, whatever his personal loyalty to Gotti and his circle, had built his entire life around a code that explicitly prohibited exactly this kind of unauthorized violence against a legitimate boss. Multiple organized crime historians and law enforcement officials who studied the period closely have concluded that Dellacroce would very likely have opposed the assassination plot had he lived long enough to be consulted about it, not out of any particular loyalty to Castellano himself, but out of his own, deeply held conviction that the Commission's authority over questions of leadership succession had to be respected, precisely because a world in which any sufficiently ambitious and violent subordinate could simply murder his way to the top was a world that would eventually consume itself entirely. This is the tragic, almost unbearable irony that sits at the very heart of Neil Dellacroce's entire legacy. The man whose life's work had been holding together an organization perpetually on the brink of tearing itself apart through exactly this kind of internal violence died just 12 days before the single most consequential act of internal violence in his organization's modern history, an act carried out by the very man he had spent over a decade protecting and mentoring, an act that would never have been contemplated, let alone executed, had Dellacroce still been alive to serve as the restraining force he had been for the entirety of his career. Some who have studied this period have gone further, suggesting that Gotti and his allies may have been aware, on some level, that Dellacroce's continued survival, however brief it might have proven regardless of any assassination plot, would have made moving against Castellano impossible, that the timing of the plot, executed so soon after Dellacroce's funeral, was not simply a matter of urgent, reactive necessity, but reflected a calculated recognition that the narrow window of opportunity created by Dellacroce's death, before any new equilibrium could reassert itself within the family, represented the only realistic chance to act. Whether or not this interpretation gives Gotti and his co-conspirators too much credit for strategic foresight, it captures something true and important about the structural role Dellacroce had played for the entirety of his career. He was not merely one powerful man among several within the Gambino family's leadership. He was, in a very real and demonstrable sense, the load-bearing wall that had kept the entire structure from collapsing in on itself, and the moment that wall was removed, the structure did exactly what load-bearing walls exist to prevent: it came down, violently, publicly, and irreversibly, in a hail of gunfire on a Manhattan sidewalk just 14 days later. John Gotti would go on to become perhaps the most famous mob boss in American history, earning the nickname, the Teflon Don, for his early ability to evade conviction despite repeated prosecutions, and later, the Dapper Don, for the expensive, flamboyant style that made him a fixture of tabloid headlines throughout the late 1980s. The very kind of public visibility and personal glory seeking that men like Dellacroce, shaped by an older, more discreet tradition, had always regarded as fundamentally dangerous to an organization that depended on operating in the shadows. Gotti's reign as boss would prove, in the end, remarkably brief and remarkably self-destructive, undone eventually by the very qualities, the flamboyance, the public visibility, the inability to exercise the kind of careful restraint that had defined Dellacroce's entire career, that had made him such compelling television but such a vulnerable target for the federal prosecutors who would eventually bring him down through the cooperation of his own underboss, Sammy Gravano, in a betrayal that would have been almost unimaginable within the code that Dellacroce had spent his life upholding. But that story, the rise and catastrophic fall of the man Neil Dellacroce had loved like a son, and the final, sobering reckoning with everything Dellacroce's life and death actually meant for the American Mafia as an institution, is where we turn for the final chapter of this story. In the years that followed Paul Castellano's assassination, the American Mafia entered a period of decline so steep and so irreversible that historians of organized crime now generally regard the mid to late 1980s as the beginning of the end for the kind of nationally coordinated, institutionally powerful criminal organization that men like Neil Dellacroce had spent their entire lives building and protecting. And to understand why, we have to look closely at what happened to John Gotti, the young soldier Dellacroce had shielded and mentored for nearly 2 decades, once he finally sat atop the throne that his mentor had spent his own career refusing to seize by force. Gotti's ascension was, at first, spectacular. He cut a public figure unlike any Gambino boss before him, expensive, hand-tailored suits, a full head of silver hair swept back with theatrical precision, a taste for the spotlight that seemed almost designed to invite exactly the kind of law enforcement and media attention that men like Dellacroce had spent their careers carefully avoiding. He was acquitted in several high-profile prosecutions during the late 1980s, escaping conviction through a combination of skilled legal representation, witness intimidation, and what many suspected, though could never definitively prove in court, was outright jury tampering. Each acquittal only added to his legend, earning him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life and long after his death, the Teflon Don, a man against whom nothing, seemingly, could ever be made to stick. But beneath this glittering, headline-grabbing surface, the very qualities that made Gotti such a compelling and publicly fascinating figure were also, simultaneously, systematically destroying the operational security that had allowed the Gambino family, and organized crime more broadly, to function and thrive for decades. Dellacroce's entire model of leadership had been built on discretion, on the understanding that power, in this world, depended fundamentally on remaining invisible to the very authorities whose job was to dismantle it. Gotti inverted this model almost entirely, seemingly relishing his public notoriety, holding court for reporters and cameras outside the Rave Night Social Club, the very headquarters Dellacroce himself had run for 2 decades with far greater care and far less visibility, in a manner that made the building, and everyone who visited it, an obvious and irresistible target for law enforcement surveillance. The FBI, recognizing exactly this vulnerability, dramatically increased its surveillance operations around the rave night throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, eventually installing listening devices that captured Gotti discussing family business with a level of specificity and carelessness that echoed, in a bitter historical irony, the exact same mistake that had doomed Angelo Ruggiero and nearly torn the family apart years earlier. Gotti, it turned out, for all his street-smart cunning and physical fearlessness, had never learned, or had simply never respected, the deeper lesson that Dellacroce's entire career had been built upon, that survival in this world depended not on confrontation or bravado, but on an almost monastic commitment to discretion, patience, and the careful, unglamorous management of other men's egos and ambitions. The final, fatal blow to Gotti's reign came not from federal surveillance alone, but from betrayal, the very thing the Code of Omerta had been specifically designed to prevent, and the very thing Neil Dellacroce had spent his entire life demonstrating he would never, under any circumstances, commit. In 1991, facing overwhelming evidence gathered from the rave night bugs and looking at the near certainty of spending the rest of his life in federal prison, Sammy Gravano, the very man who had stood beside Gotti in the car outside Sparks Steakhouse, watching Paul Castellano die, made the decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors, becoming one of the highest-ranking mob figures in American history to break the code of silence and testify against his own boss. Gravano's testimony proved devastating and conclusive. In 1992, John Gotti was convicted on multiple charges, including the murder of Paul Castellano, and sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He would die behind bars in 2002, having spent the final decade of his life exactly where men like Neil Dellacroce, through decades of careful discretion and restraint, had always managed to avoid, permanently removed from the world he had once dominated, undone not by rival gunmen but by the American legal system he had spent his career publicly mocking. It is almost impossible to tell this final chapter of the story without confronting, directly and honestly, the question that has haunted organized crime historians for decades: how much of Gotti's catastrophic downfall might have been prevented, or at least delayed and softened, had Neil Dellacroce lived even a few years longer. This is, of course, an unanswerable counterfactual, the kind of speculative question that can never be resolved with historical certainty. But the shape of the answer, drawn from everything we know about who Dellacroce was and how he operated across 5 decades inside this world, seems reasonably clear. Dellacroce would very likely never have permitted the kind of unauthorized, headline-grabbing assassination that put Gotti on the throne in the first place. He would almost certainly have counseled against the flamboyant public visibility that made Gotti simultaneously beloved by the tabloid press and catastrophically vulnerable to federal surveillance. And his own decades of demonstrated, unbreakable loyalty to the code of silence stood in stark, illuminating contrast to the betrayal that ultimately destroyed Gotti's empire from within, a betrayal that becomes almost predictable, in retrospect, when you consider that Gotti's own leadership style, so different from Dellacroce's careful cultivation of genuine loyalty through fairness and protection, had never inspired in his own subordinates the same deep, structural commitment to the code that Dellacroce had spent his life demonstrating and, in turn, receiving from the men beneath him. This is, in the end, the central lesson embedded in the entire arc of Neil Dellacroce's extraordinary life, and it is worth sitting with, because it cuts against almost everything the popular imagination assumes about power in the criminal underworld. We tend to imagine organized crime, in film and television and popular mythology, as a world ruled by the boldest, the most violent, the most ruthlessly ambitious men willing to seize whatever they want through sheer force of will. And certainly, that mythology captures something true about how men like Albert Anastasia rose to power, and about the raw, undeniable capacity for violence that men like Dellacroce himself possessed and occasionally exercised throughout his younger years. But Dellacroce's real legacy, the quality that made him genuinely exceptional even within a world full of dangerous and capable men, was not his capacity for violence. It was his capacity for restraint. It was his willingness, again and again, across 5 decades and through some of the most painful and humiliating moments imaginable, his mentor's murder, being passed over for the position he had earned, watching a less capable man ascend to the throne he believed was rightfully his, to choose the harder, less glamorous, less immediately satisfying path of preserving the structure over satisfying his own personal grievances. He held the walls of that structure up, quite literally, for the better part of 30 years, absorbing tension after tension, mediating conflict after conflict, protecting the men beneath him while never once betraying the men above him, and in doing so, he gave the Gambino family a stability and a durability that neither Castellano's cold, corporate remoteness nor Gotti's reckless, spotlight-craving bravado ever came close to replicating. And when he finally died, worn down not by a rival's bullet but by the slow, unglamorous mechanism of cancer, an ending that feels, in its own way, strikingly appropriate for a man whose entire genius had been the patient, unglamorous work of holding things together rather than the dramatic, cinematic work of tearing them apart, the entire structure he had spent his life supporting came down within a matter of days. 12 days from his funeral to Paul Castellano's blood on the sidewalk outside Sparks Steakhouse. A handful of years more before John Gotti's own empire collapsed under the weight of exactly the recklessness and exactly the flamboyance that Dellacroce had spent his career quietly working to contain. There is a particular kind of tragedy in being the person whose value only becomes fully, undeniably visible once they are gone, the load-bearing wall nobody thinks about until the ceiling comes down. Neil Dellacroce spent nearly 50 years as exactly that wall for one of the most powerful and most dangerous organizations in American history, absorbing pressure that would have shattered a lesser man, mediating between forces that, left unchecked, would have destroyed each other and everyone connected to them. He was a killer. He was, by any honest reckoning, a genuinely dangerous and violent man who built his reputation, in part, through acts that no one watching this story should romanticize or excuse. But within the dark, self-contained logic of the world he inhabited, he was also something rarer and, in its own strange way, more remarkable, a man who understood that true power was not about seizing the crown for yourself, but about being strong enough, disciplined enough, and patient enough to hold the entire kingdom together, even when the crown never came. He never became boss. History remembers the bosses, remembers Carlo Gambino's quiet strategic genius, remembers Paul Castellano's corporate ambition and his violent end, remembers John Gotti's flamboyant rise and his catastrophic, betrayal-soaked fall. Neil Dellacroce occupies a strange, almost overlooked space in that history, the essential man who never sat at the very top, and yet without whom none of the men who did sit there could have held power for nearly as long as they did. Perhaps that is the truest, most fitting epitaph for a man who spent his entire life working in the shadow of other men's thrones, not the king, but the reason the kingdom stood for as long as it did. And perhaps, in the end, that is a kind of power more enduring, and certainly more difficult to achieve, than the crown itself ever was. If this story pulled you into the shadows of Mulberry Street and left you thinking about loyalty, power, and the quiet men who hold empires together, make sure you subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting from the darkest corners of organized crime history. Like this video if you want to see more, and drop a comment telling me which figure from the underworld you want us to uncover next. Until then, stay close to the shadows, because that's exactly where the truth always lives.